So hi everyone. I'm sorry it's taken me so long to do the part two of the Kray twins. I had some internet issues and had to get the guy out today to get it all sorted because the video was not matching the audio and it was really aggravating me. Anyway, hopefully it's fixed now. So this is part two. As I told you, I grew up where they ran the East End of London, and let's go into the rest of it. Hold on a second.
Supported by the villainy of the firm and protected by the wall of fear and silence they left in their wake, the twins would never be more powerful than they were at this moment.
After the McCowan trial, where I sat through a lot of the trial talking to members of the Kray family, I got my first real meeting with them. I dropped into the Grave Maurice one day, which was their drinking place at the time. And there they were standing at the bar. They were playing the big-time movie gangsters of just being the strong, silent men. But to anybody who is straight, coming from the big world, they really looked pretty stupid. To me, the impression was just that they had nothing to say, so they said nothing. But to the people there, it was strong, silent, powerful men. In publicity terms, they cashed in on everything. When the Boothby scandal broke, the fact that their names got into the papers, apologies and all, were great publicity for them. It showed that they were even stronger than Fleet Street. When they were acquitted in the McCowan case, again, for them it was marvellous publicity, and they made the most of it.
Well, in all clubs you get an occasional drunk, and sometimes they have to be slung out, and that's why there's dorm and that. But I suppose it's like clubland all over the world, really. It's just the same as. I don't suppose it can be that bad as people won't go to them, really, would they?
Ronald, what do you think about clubland in London?
Well, I think most clubs are very respectable, and I don't think there's any trouble at all in them, except occasionally.
Ronald, what are you going to do now?
Well, I'd like to go abroad for a short while, and then I'd like to be left home. I intend to get married in the near future. I did before this case, but it's put back over the case, and I'll just get married as soon as possible,
In 1965, Reggie married Frances Shay. He had courted her since she was a schoolgirl. It was described by the press as the East End's wedding of the year.
Reggie and Frances' wedding was a very big affair. David Bailey was there doing the photography. There was Diana Dawes, numerous people. It was packed.
I think it's the first time I've been invited to a thought-to-be-known gangster's wedding. It's quite an occasion. When the service started off, the singing was a bit hesitant, and a rather large man went down the aisle and saying, "Do I go one row and then the other? Reggie wants you to sing." And things livened up a lot after that.
Before Reggie and Frances could celebrate their first anniversary, Ronnie Kray was to execute George Cornell in the public bar of the Blind Beggar pub.
Okay, so before we go any further with that, just tell you a little bit about Frances. She was a typical East End girl. Back then you were raised to cook, clean, look after your man. That was about it, really. And once she got in with Reggie Kray, there was no escape. It's not like she was miserable, mainly because of Ronnie. Ronnie hated her. He tried to sabotage the wedding. He didn't want his brother marrying her. He absolutely despised her. And Reggie married her anyway. And once they were married, he did his best to just sabotage the marriage. He would drag Reggie out all night long and He wouldn't come home for days and that type of thing. And so, you know, it didn't end well, but it really kind of destroyed Reggie, I have to say that. 1 second.
George was very cocksure of himself. He knew he could use himself. He knew he could handle himself. He wasn't frightened of no man. He was calling Ronnie a big puff and all that. And of course, the inevitable happened. Ronnie had a gun on him. Ronnie pulled his out, and I believe the words were said by Cornell. Oh, look who's here. With that, Ronnie went up to him, drew the gun out, pointed. He thought it was a joke. Pulled the trigger. That was it. He just shot him dead.
Perfectly gratuitous. Cornell had not been any threat to him. He'd insulted him about his homosexuality and stuff like that. But there was no economic threat from Cornell or the gang that he was a part of, which was the Richardsons. But when Ronnie Kray killed him, I mean, he said, "I've got my button," just as the Yanks say that when they've killed someone.
Over 30 people witnessed the shooting. Not one would pick Ronnie Kray from the identity parade. It seemed this outlandish act of violence had only served to strengthen their position.
We eventually traced most of the witnesses there, but none of them would give evidence that they'd seen Ronnie Kray. They were immovable because there was always this wall of silence. First of all, this natural wall of silence that people in the East End don't talk to the coppers. And the second thing was that this wall of fear.
The potency of the gangster doesn't just come from his capacity and willingness to use violence. It happens the world over that all these kind of illegal communities generate a no-informing rule. It's very difficult to, as it would be, a criminal with other criminals, having to cooperate with other criminals if it's also seen as perfectly reasonable to inform when it suits you.
Yeah, so that's very true. You didn't go to the police for anything. Nothing was ever reported to the police. No fighting. If anything happened and somebody needed to be taken care of, it was taken care of within the manor. Going to the police was a no-no. So, no, he went and shot Cornell in front of 30 people. And nobody saw it. And that's exactly how the East End was as well when I was growing up. Same thing.
So this rule is really at the heart of what we call the criminal enterprise.
Nobody took their troubles to the police. You know, the police were part of the enemy. They're usually part of the thing that broke up the strikes and the docks and things like that. I mean, the police were regarded as being, you know, outside your society. And if you had something serious to settle, you tried to settle it between yourselves, and that sometimes did involve violence.
Cornell's killing escalated a long-standing feud with the Richardsons, a rival gang from south of the river. To support them in this campaign, the firm wanted Frank Mitchell, the Mad Axeman. In 1967, they arranged his escape from Dartmoor prison. A massive search ensued. He was hiding here in a flat in the East End of London, looked after by Albert Donahue, a trusted member of the firm. Soon afterwards, the Richardsons were imprisoned before the showdown could take place. Mitchell was still a wanted man, but not by the Krays.
If the twins got him out and the twins are looking after him, nobody can kill him in front of the twins. There's only one people who can hurt him, and that's the twins themselves. The only thing I'll put it down to, he got too much trouble. He was great big massive guy. I can assure you they could chew and eat them two, plus half the firm for breakfast and think nothing of it. He's a great big massive guy, strong as a lion. Maybe he got out of line, they couldn't handle it. They couldn't handle him, they didn't know what to do, and the only thing they knew how is get rid of him. couldn't put him back in prison. They couldn't just, because they would be letting themselves down in front of the firm by grassing him up. They can't say, come and get Mitchell, he's here. That's grassing. Them days, it was never, ever heard of. Nobody grassed in the underworld them days.
Frank Mitchell's body was never found. Officially, his murder remains unsolved. The story of the Krays has several victims. None sadder than Frances. Amidst the glamour, she had become increasingly disillusioned with her life and found it impossible to escape the notoriety of her husband or compete with the intensity of his relationship with his twin brother.
I think Ronnie mixed the pudding up there quite a bit, and very much the domineering factor of the two. He might have got, and I don't know what he'd done to Frances, but all I know is he was constantly rowing.
In June 1967, Frances killed herself with an overdose of tablets. Reggie insisted that she be buried in her wedding dress.
It really slaughtered him. And
Well, for a week or
he just didn't know what he was doing. He was wandering the days. And when she died, he gave up. He had a death wish, I'm sure. In many.
Okay, yeah, so Frances ended up committing suicide. However, rumour had it that Ronnie had something to do with that, that it wasn't really a suicide, but that's rumour. He did hate her, and he was a paranoid schizophrenic, so I wouldn't have put it past him, but there's no real evidence of that. You know, it's just something that people said in the East End back then, that, you know, he had something to do with Frances's death. So
Reggie's only escape was into the company of his brother, but by now Ronnie's behaviour offered little sanctuary. He now saw murder as a demonstration of allegiance to the firm. Reggie had yet to prove his.
McVitie was £2 a week bandit. He was not a villain of their calibre by any means. So he posed no threat to them. So any suggestion that he was killed in retaliation for threats that he'd offered them is just nonsense. But the story that was circulated was that this was a crime that was really motiveless. The only motive that could be ascribed to it was that Ronald Kray had said, having killed Cornell, well, I'm my one, Reggie, now you do yours. He thought that he'd been invited with the rest of them to a drink up to a party. You can imagine his surprise when Reggie Kray suddenly appeared and offered a gun to his head and pulled the trigger.
Run! Ronnie was always winding him up. I've done mine, you go and do yours. And he more or less wound him up that day. Got him really, truly at it, and he got him in the front. I don't think Reggie would have done it, but Ronnie wound him up. Put a man to man, no way. I mean, I knew Jack very, very well. Jack was a very, very good pal of mine. Whatever he'd done or whatever he was, it didn't warrant that.
You've left us no choice, Jack!
He tried to get out of the window, but he was dragged back by the people there. And then he was held by Ronnie Kray. And by this time, Reggie had been given a kitchen knife, one of those long, serrated kitchen knives. He hit McVitie, first of all, on the jaw, and then he stabbed him a number of times until eventually the poor man fell to the floor when he pushed the knife through his throat and twisted it and pulled it out again. Well, of course, it didn't take long for McVitie to die.
Contrary to Ronnie's deranged beliefs, McVitie's killing did not prove to be an act of allegiance. Quite the opposite. The gratuitous nature of their actions had begun to alarm members of the firm. The wall of silence was beginning to crumble.
You just go around killing your own people. You've got Cornell, you've got Mitchell. Well, Cornell was one of our own, but he still You don't go shooting the bloke because he called you a puff. Half the world would be dead. You can't do that. And Mitchell, well, look what they'd done to Mitchell. And they went and done that to Jack. Well, that to me, that was the end.
The police campaign gathered momentum, but Nipper Read was insistent that the investigation gather substantive evidence against the twins before any attempt was made to charge them with murder.
We first of all started out looking at, again, the frauds. And these really formed the basis of the investigation. And so we went on from there to investigate any other kind of crime, with the exception of murder. And this was a very positive decision that I made, because I felt that if we started to investigate murders, then the question of the witnesses' safety might be jeopardized.
The mood of the firm was very, very, very dodgy. People were not turning up at the meets anymore. They didn't want to come to the meets. They made excuses why not to be there. And the nervousness on the two twins that was showing, you know, that they can virtually, it meant they virtually pull out a gun and shoot you in the middle of the road or in the house or wherever.
It was almost common knowledge that Ronnie Kray had shot George Cornell in The Blind Beggars. As a matter of fact, when later I started to investigate it, people in the East End said to me that the Krays did everything but take the front page of the Times to advertise the fact. I mean, this enhanced their position as gang leaders, you see.
They must have felt such immense power. You see, when they done their first killing with Cornell, it must have been about a year or 2 years before they nicked them. So it must have given them a very high sense of power, the untouchables. No one was safe. No one.
In 1965, the Krays had seemed invulnerable to prosecution. 3 years later, a trail of senseless killings destroyed that position. They were now so feared that even members of the firm thought it safer they be put away.
Leslie Payne was a fraudster. He didn't need violence because he could charm people, he could persuade people. And so when he realized that there was no measure by which he could control the violence of the Krays, he decided then that that was too much for him and he walked away. And so when I saw him, I was able to persuade him that it would be important and beneficial to him, because I could offer him protection, to make a statement outlining all of the Krays' activities. And this he did. He didn't, unfortunately for me, know anything about the murders, because by that time he'd long since left them. But he did tell me about the frauds, about the long-firm frauds, and certain other activities that the Krays had been involved in. He told me in no uncertain terms that the Krays had threatened his life. And so as far as he was concerned, then it was in his own interest to see them put away, and hopefully for a long time.
On the 8th of May 1968, Nipper Read coordinated a massive police swoop to arrest the Krays and over 70 members of the firm. It was the start of an operation that would rewrite British legal history.
It was all timed for 6 o'clock in the morning. They were all provided with arrest sheets and descriptions of the people that they had to arrest and so on. And of course, these were all over the place. They were all over the East End and all over other places in London, of course. And so off we went, and I went with my then deputy, Frank Cater, and some other officers. And we went to Braithwaite House, which was where the Krays were then living. And there we found Ronnie and Reggie in bed, and they were both arrested and taken back to West End Central Police Station. In fact, we were the first team back of all the teams that had been sent out that night. We probably got the easiest operation.
Yeah, just what's interesting about that, Braithwaite House, you see those, they look like a block of flats. They were like council houses, like government housing, you know, and the amount of money the Krays had, they always stayed within their manor, you know. They didn't move out to fancy houses wherever, you know. Their old mum lived on a street, you know, where the houses were very close together, and they would hold their meetings there. They would be there all the time. It was a little bit like in Goodfellas, where they had the guy in the trunk and they stopped by Joe Pesci's mother and she makes food and whatever. That was kind of what they did with their mother Violet, who they loved to death, and she doted on them. It was, well, I wouldn't call it an unnatural relationship, but they were very, very close. The other guy earlier with the hair and the pink tie, that was their older brother, Charlie. And out of, you know, the family, really, Charlie was the one with the brains. So I just thought I'd try that in there. So let's.
I suppose.
Now that the Krays were safely inside, work on the case could begin in earnest. There was still no evidence or testimony that would convict either twin of murder.
What I wanted to do in this operation was not make the mistake that I did in the 1964-65 one. And that was that I thought once the Krays themselves had been arrested, people who'd been victims of their activities would come into the station and say, I want to give evidence. They never did that. And so I learned then that there was this wall of silence in the East End that was almost insurmountable. Once they were all inside, it had been generated from the cells of the Krays and others that now they were all together, they got to stick together. And that if anybody was found to be attempting to give evidence for the prosecution, then certain repercussions would occur and their wives and family would be in danger.
The twins could no longer intimidate. They had become too volatile and too violent.
Albert Donahue, who was one of the senior lieutenants, one of the big hefty men, his mother came to see me. He'd been arrested and charged. And his mother came to see me at Bow Street Court and said he wanted to see me in prison. And so I went along to see him. And then he told me this story. For the very first time, we got to know what had happened to Frank Mitchell. According to Donahue, he was taken out into a van on the pretext that he was going to another location in Kent. And once he was inside the van, he was shot by two people that were sitting in the back of the van. And so that was the first murder charge that we preferred.
The pieces were fitting into place. Nipper had the evidence against the twins for fraud and murder, but McVitie's killing would be more difficult to prove.
One of the problems is, of course, that if you've got a conspiracy like that where a number of people are together when they commit an act, unless one of them is willing to give evidence of the prosecution, then you can't mount a successful prosecution. And so this was the situation as far as they were concerned. We needed one of this group to come forward. We knew basically what had happened, that this had happened in the basement of this house in Evering Road, but it was a question of getting witnesses. There was one man missing, a man called Ronnie Hart. He was a relation, or it suggested that he was a relation of the Krays, a cousin. And he'd never been arrested in the first sweep because we'd no evidence against him. We managed to trace him, and eventually he was persuaded to make a statement in which he said exactly what happened. And he was the prime witness against the Krays.
One piece was still missing: Cornell. A key witness to the murder had been a barmaid from the Blind Beggar pub. She was terrified of the Krays and steadfastly refused to testify against them.
She had seen who had killed Cornell. She knew him. She actually knew Ronald Kray. And so we began to give her as much comfort and assistance as we could at that time. But we weren't getting anywhere because at that time people didn't believe that the Krays were going to be held in custody and successfully prosecuted. They believed, as they'd always believed, that they would walk on water again, that they would be able to be acquitted and come back to their usual habits in the East End of London.
Given a new identity, the barmaid was moved out of London to a secret address in Essex.
All right, so I just want to say something about this because this made me just literally laugh out loud. And Johnny the Greek, if you watch this, you'll be laughing as well. I mean, how far, is the Mile End to, let's say, Ilford, Essex, or, Barking? It's like down the road. They moved her to into witness protection down the street, literally. And at the time that they moved her, I mean, the Krays were inside, they were locked up. and most of the guys along with him, but there was still a lot of people on the street. I mean, I would have been like, are you joking? You know, you're moving me, 15 minutes away? She could have been walking around doing shopping. I mean, anyone could have got to her. It was ridiculous, you know. Oh, my God. I think our witness protection program now is a little better. You know, they move them to different countries like Holland, Germany, Spain, whatever. But 10 minutes down the road, I mean, I ask you, anyway.
Eventually, she was persuaded by the nature of the support that she had that she could tell the truth. And in fact, later on in court, she very dramatically pointed to Ronnie Kray and said that is the man that she'd seen in the Blind Beggars Public House.
The trial started in January 1969. It was to become the longest and most expensive trial in British legal history, with more people in the dock accused of murder than there had ever been before.
And then I went along to court rather fresh to it, not having seen them for 3 or 4 years. And what was immediately clear was the changes that had come over them. Ronnie was fat and soft, and was clearly not in control of himself. Reggie was more so. During the trial, we had these awful outbursts from Ronald Kray. If he had any chance of impressing the jury, that chance disappeared with those outbursts. The climax of the trial wasn't the dramatic appearance of witnesses who people had thought would never stand up against the Krays. The climax came when Ronnie Kray was in the witness box himself and was being goaded very effectively by the prosecutor, Mr. Jones. He eventually fell apart and screamed at Mr. Jones, "You big fat slob." Jones just sort of rocked back and let that sink into the jury. Here was the king of the underworld descending to name-calling. And if anybody was the great fat slob, it was Ronnie Kray.
On the 5th of March 1969, both Ronnie and Reggie Kray were found guilty of the charges brought against them.
I wasn't surprised at all. I expected. They said they would get 30 years. They told the barrister, they told the screws in prison in Brixton they would get 30 years, and they did.
I was absolutely overwhelmed. I realised that if somebody had said something to me, I couldn't answer because I was full with emotion. Because this was now a situation that had been going on so long. You know, my whole reputation, my life depended on this almost. It was a fulfilment of an enormous undertaking by my squad. And you know, I felt justified that they'd done all the work that was necessary of them and that we'd achieved something, really achieved something.
Aunt Violet, myself and Mum was in the kitchen and we was listening to the wireless. And when it came on that they got 30 years, you know, we was dumbstruck, really. We couldn't believe it, like, and Aunt Violet looked at Mother and she said, "Oh, I think they've made a mistake." She said, "I'm sure they have." She said, "Maybe they'll say later, like, it's not so long."
I'm not going to waste words on you. In my view, society has earned a rest from your activities, and I recommend that you be held for at least 30 years.
It amazes me that a gang that was so badly organized, badly thought out, badly managed, could be so successful. The only way it worked was because their public relations was brilliant.
I feel they were a part of the 60s, like the minicar and Twiggy and other things. You know, they were a part of it.
Billy Hill and Jack Spot had a sort of notoriety, but they hardly promoted themselves. And the other notorious East End villains, Burke and Hare, went about their murdering fairly quietly, and Jack the Ripper may have left a note, but he was hardly exactly photographed with royals.
they attracted people to them. You know, people who they should look up to finished up looking up to them, sort of thing. And Ronnie, he was his own man, you know. Nobody was going to tell him what to do. He was the boss.
He was much more a gangster for the thrill of being dominant and powerful rather than money. And perhaps this was expedited by his mental condition that took pleasure in violence. And of course, this was a factor in their ultimate downfall.
The twins have now served over 2/3 of their sentence. They were released for one day in 1982 to attend the funeral of their mother, Violet. Ronnie is now a psychiatric patient at Broadmoor and could stay there indefinitely. Reggie is still at Lewis Prison. The government have given no indication that he will be considered for parole.
What's special about the Kray twins compared to any other gangsters is simply that they were twins.
Yeah, so both of them are dead now, actually. Ronnie died, they kept him in Broadmoor. He died in the psychiatric hospital. And Reggie, he was in Lewis Prison, another prison I had been to many times. It's out in Brighton, visiting, of course, not as an inmate. And they, he got bladder cancer, I want to say, and there was a big like hoo-ha about letting him out. I mean, he was on his deathbed literally when they let him out, like he was going to do anything. It's ridiculous. And he spent his last few months, I guess, in a hotel. Over the weekend, I'm going to show you a video of him. He was interviewed before he died, and it's really, really interesting to watch him. He was never as crazy as Ronnie, but he kind of was. You know, when he's telling you his stories, there's nothing. It's like blank. You know, he says everything so matter-of-factly. I find him fascinating when he's, you know, he can be telling you something really terrible and he's just really matter-of-fact, you know, about it. It's really interesting. And, you know, like I said, they had a very close relationship with their mother, to the point that when they got 30 years, she's like, well, I think they've made a mistake. You know, they're going to say later it's not that long. No, they're not. You know, now in England, it's slightly different. Like 30 years, you're going to do 30 years before you're even considered for parole. And parole doesn't come easy at all. No. And sometimes, I mean, they might sentence you to life with a tariff, and they call it a tariff, where you're going to serve at least 30 years before you're considered for parole, or at least you do a tariff of 15 years before you're considered for parole. But that doesn't mean you're getting out at that time. You know, they're really quite stricter with the sentencing than they are in the US. You know, ultimately it's a sad story, but you know, Ronnie needed to be in Broadmoor, but there were a lot of guys, you know, because they were out of control, they would put them in, they would classify them as criminally insane and put them in the loony bin and do electric shock treatments and all kinds of stuff. I'm going to introduce you to Roy Shaw. That happened to him. That was a really sad story. For example, someone like John A. Light, Sammy the Bull, they probably because of you know, the violence, they would have probably have classified them as criminally insane and put them in a criminally insane prison, you know, hospital actually. I mean, the good thing about Broadmoor is it was a little bit more lax than prison. They were allowed to wear their clothes. They were allowed to do more stuff. But I mean, it wasn't the greatest place to be with it, you know, the way they treated you. But it worked out probably better than actual prison. In fact, there's one story very early on. Ronnie was in a psychiatric hospital, and he was there like, I don't know how long, but Reggie went to visit him, and they went with a reporter, and they came out, and the reporter's looking at Reggie, you know, like, how was Ronnie? How's he doing? And Ronnie says, it's me, I'm Ronnie. They switched places, you know, changed clothes, and Ronnie left. So he went on the lam for a couple of weeks, and they did a thing where he could turn himself in, and he didn't suffer any consequences. They let him out of the place not long after that, but I thought that was hysterical, you know. Anyway, so that's the story of them. Now, I'm probably going to do a live maybe tomorrow at some point over the weekend. I'm going to do my psychopath of the week and introduce you to some more British criminals, you know, that were quite interesting or grew up. You know, I grew up around in when I was growing up. And Johnny the Greek, if you manage to catch me live at some point, I'd love you to come on. I have a feeling we know each other. I'm pretty sure we do, because we kind of know all the same people. And, you know, we must know each other, I'm thinking, but I can't place you. But anyway, everyone take care. Have a good evening, and I'll see you later.